When police K9 dog found a tiny witness, then what happened next will leave you speechless. A cold night, a brutal crime, and a terrified little puppy, the only witness to a murder. Officer Christopher had no idea that this fragile creature held the key to a dark secret, one that would change everything. Officer Christopher walked into the dark alley. His boots crunched on broken glass. A weak streetlight flickered, making long shadows on the wet brick walls. Lightning, his canine partner, moved ahead. His nose sniffed the ground, checking every part of the crime scene. The alley smelled bad, like old trash and something else, something sharp. Blood. Christopher looked around. The victim, a young woman named Emma, was found here 2 nights ago. She died in silence. No one saw anything. No clues. No suspects. Just a case getting colder. Lightning suddenly stopped. His ears stood up. His body became stiff. He let out a low growl. His eyes focused on a pile of boxes near Emma's things. Christopher stepped closer, hand on his gun. He listened. A soft whimper. Something small. Something scared. Carefully, he reached into the pile. He pulled out a tiny, shaking puppy. Its fur was dirty. Its big, dark eyes looked afraid. It was so small it fit in his hand. "What do we have here?" Christopher whispered. The puppy pushed itself against him, shaking all over. It wasn't just scared, it was terrified. Lightning sniffed the puppy, then looked up at Christopher, as if he understood something. This little one had been here that night. It had seen something. Christopher's radio made a crackling sound. "Officer Christopher, return to base. The captain says there's nothing more to find." He looked at the crime scene one last time. Then he looked at the puppy. Maybe the captain was wrong. Maybe there was something more. Back at the station, Christopher put the puppy on his desk. It sat there, small and weak, watching him with tired eyes. He poured water into a bowl and placed it in front of the pup. It waited, then started drinking, its little tongue moving fast. "Where did you come from?" Christopher asked softly. "And what did you see?" Lightning lay beside the desk, watching the puppy closely. The little dog had survived something. But what? Had it been there the night Emma was killed? Had it seen who did it? Christopher opened the case file again. Emma had no enemies. Nothing was stolen. No clues. Just a life taken for no reason. He looked at the puppy again. "What if you're the only witness?" he whispered. The door to his office opened. Captain Reynolds stood there with his arms crossed. He looked annoyed. "What's this?" the captain asked, nodding at the puppy. "I found it at the crime scene," Christopher said. "It could have been there that night." The captain let out a short laugh. "A puppy? What's next? You gonna put it on the witness stand?" Christopher ignored the joke. It was hiding. It's scared. Maybe it saw something. Reynolds sighed. "Look, I know you want to solve this case, but there's nothing left to find. We need to move on." Christopher looked at the puppy. It curled into a small ball, still tense. He couldn't let it go. "Not yet. I'll keep it for now," he said. "It's evidence." The captain shook his head. "Fine, but don't waste time on this." The door closed behind him. Christopher sat there with the puppy and Lightning. He ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't imagining things. This little dog was the key to something. He just had to figure out what. Later that night, Christopher sat at his desk. Case files were spread out in front of him. The puppy slept in a small blanket, breathing softly. Lightning lay nearby, watching over it. Something about this case felt wrong. No evidence. No fight. It was too clean. He pulled up the crime scene photos. He looked at every detail. Then he saw something, a faint smudge near Emma's things. No one had tested it. Could it be from the killer? Christopher's mind raced. Maybe the answer wasn't in the reports. Maybe it was with the only one everyone ignored. The silent witness, curled up in the blanket beside him. The case wasn't over. It was just starting. Christopher sat at his desk, looking at the small puppy. It was curled up in a blanket. Its little body moved up and down as it breathed. Lightning sat next to it, his sharp eyes watching everything. Something about this case felt strange. Christopher had worked on many cases, but this one was different. There were no signs of a fight. No clues. Now, the only living thing from that night was this tiny dog. Could it help him find the truth? The puppy moved its head. Then, suddenly, it let out a low growl. Christopher looked up. Officer Miller had just walked past his office. The puppy's reaction was fast and strong. It trembled, but it didn't stop growling. Christopher leaned forward. "You don't like him?" he whispered to the puppy. Lightning stood up. His ears went up, and he sniffed the air. Christopher's gut told him this was important. The puppy had seen something. It remembered something. Christopher took a deep breath and picked up the puppy. He needed to see something. He walked down the hall with Lightning beside him. He went toward the alley where Emma had died. The puppy was quiet in his arms, but its body felt stiff. It was scared. At the crime scene, Christopher put the puppy down. It waited, then slowly sniffed the ground and started moving. Christopher followed, his heart beating fast. The puppy led him deeper into the alley, past where Emma's body was found. Then it stopped. It whimpered, looking at a pile of old crates. Lightning moved closer, sniffing the area. Christopher bent down and reached into the pile. His fingers touched fabric. He pulled it out. It was a torn piece of Emma's jacket. His mind raced. Why was this here? Why hadn't anyone found it before? Lightning sniffed the fabric and barked. Christopher felt a shiver go through him. "This means something, doesn't it?" he whispered. The puppy whimpered and backed away. Christopher followed its eyes. It wasn't looking at the jacket. It was staring at the dark street beyond the alley. Someone had been here that night. Someone dangerous. Christopher put the fabric in his pocket. He had to be careful. His boss thought this case was over. But Christopher knew there was more. Back at the station, Christopher sat at his desk, thinking. He touched the torn fabric. Something was wrong with this case. If Emma had fought back, why were there no other signs? The crime scene had been too clean. The puppy was curled up again, but its body was still tense. Lightning lay beside it, listening to every sound. Christopher sighed. He needed to put the pieces together. The next morning, Christopher looked through Emma's records, searching for anything useful. Then, he saw something. A name. Jacob Reed. A man Emma had reported 6 months ago. A man with a criminal record. A man who had disappeared after she died. Christopher sat up straight. His heart pounded. Was this the suspect? He checked the report. Emma had said Jacob followed her. He had scared her. She had asked for help. Christopher's hands clenched. Why had no one taken her seriously? He picked up his phone to call for a search on Jacob Reed. Just then, the puppy lifted its head. It stared at the door. A second later, someone knocked. Christopher held his phone tightly. He looked at Lightning. Something felt wrong. The door opened. Officer Miller stepped in. His face showed nothing. Christopher looked at the puppy. Its body was stiff. Its fur stood up. It growled again, low and afraid. Miller looked at the puppy and laughed. "What's with the dog?" Christopher didn't answer. His mind was working fast. The puppy had reacted to Miller before. Now, it was doing it again. Something wasn't right. "I'm just taking care of it for now," Christopher said. He didn't want to give anything away. Miller nodded. "The captain wants to see you. He says we're closing the case." Christopher narrowed his eyes. "Closing it?" "Yeah," Miller said. "Not enough evidence." Christopher clenched his jaw. He looked at the puppy. It was still staring at Miller. It was still shaking. Something was very wrong. As soon as Miller left, Christopher grabbed his phone. He called a number. His voice was firm. "I need an update on Jacob Reed. Now!" His instinct screamed at him. If the station wanted to close this case, someone wanted it buried. If the puppy had been there that night, if it reacted to certain people, then maybe the killer wasn't just some stranger. Maybe the real danger was closer than he thought. Christopher walked fast through the station. His mind was busy. He held his phone in his hand. The update on Jacob Reed had come in, but it was not what he expected. Reed had been missing for months. No one had seen him since Emma's death. Lightning walked beside him. His steps were quiet, but he was alert. The puppy was inside Christopher's jacket, warm and safe. But something still felt wrong. This case was not just about Jacob Reed. Someone else was out there, watching them. Christopher stopped by his car and took a deep breath. He needed to think. Then his phone buzzed again. A message popped up. "Stop digging. You're next." His fingers tightened around the phone. Someone was trying to scare him. It would not work. He looked at Lightning. The dog's ears stood up, his body stiff. He sensed something too. Christopher's gut told him this was not over. It was just the beginning. That night, Christopher sat in his apartment, looking at his case notes. The puppy curled up on his lap, sleeping. Lightning lay by the door, ready for anything. Something did not make sense in Emma's case. No forced entry. No real fight. But she had been scared. She had reported someone. Was it really Jacob Reed? Christopher looked at her phone records again. One number showed up many times. He frowned and grabbed his phone. He dialed. The call rang once, twice. Then someone picked up. Silence. Then click. The call ended. Christopher's stomach felt tight. Someone knew he was close. A loud noise outside made him jump. Lightning growled and ran to the door. Christopher grabbed his gun and moved fast. He looked through the window. Nothing. Then he saw it. A dark figure moving away. Someone had been watching him. He was not safe here. The next morning, Christopher went back to the station. He had not slept. His mind was still working. The puppy was with him, as was Lightning. Something about the little dog gave him hope. It had survived that night for a reason. As he entered the station, Officer Miller looked at him. Too closely. The puppy shook in Christopher's arms. Christopher walked past Miller without speaking. He could feel Miller's eyes watching him. He had a bad feeling. He sat at his desk and looked deeper into Emma's life. He needed to know who she was afraid of. Then he found it. A report buried under many papers. Emma had worked for a security company. She was fired after reporting something bad. The name of her boss? Officer Miller. Christopher felt a chill go through him. The puppy had reacted to Miller for a reason. He had been there that night. Emma had feared him. Christopher looked up. Miller was watching him again. Their eyes met. For the first time, Miller looked uneasy. Christopher stood up slowly. He had to act now. But before he could move, the lights in the station flickered. Then, everything went dark. Christopher's heart beat fast as the station went dark. He held his gun, standing still listening. Lightning growled beside him, ready to fight. The puppy shook in his arms, but its small eyes stayed wide open. It knew something was wrong. Then, footsteps. Slow, careful steps in the silence. Someone was coming. Christopher moved toward his desk, holding his gun tight. The emergency lights flickered, giving the room a dim glow. A shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. It was Miller. "I know it's you," Christopher said, his voice strong. "You killed Emma." Miller didn't reply. He walked closer, his face cold. In his hand, he held a knife. Christopher held his gun steady. "You thought no one saw you that night," he said. "But someone did. This little guy." He looked down at the puppy. Miller's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the puppy in Christopher's arms. Then suddenly he jumped forward. Lightning moved first. The big dog leaped between them, knocking Miller off balance. Christopher kicked the knife away. It slid across the floor. Miller got up fast and tried to run, but Lightning was faster. He jumped on Miller, forcing him down. The puppy barked, as if cheering for Lightning. Other officers ran in, guns raised. "Freeze!" Captain Reynolds shouted. Miller stopped moving, his face pale. Christopher took a deep breath and lowered his gun. It was over. That night, Christopher sat in his office, looking at the puppy. The little dog wagged its tail and looked up at him with bright eyes. It had been small and scared, but in the end, it had helped solve the case. Lightning lay on the floor, tired but proud. Christopher reached down and scratched his ears. "Good boy," he whispered. The door opened, and Captain Reynolds walked in. "Miller confessed," he said. "Emma found out he was doing illegal work at the security firm. She was going to tell people." He stopped her before she could. Christopher nodded. He had thought this was the truth, but hearing it made him feel cold. "You did good," Reynolds said. "Take some time off. You need it." Christopher looked at the puppy. It had no home. It had lost someone too. He made his choice. "I'm keeping him." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Another partner?" Christopher smiled. "Yeah, he's family now." The puppy barked happily. Lightning wagged his tail. For the first time in a long time, Christopher felt happy. He picked up the puppy, knowing one thing for sure. He, Lightning, and their new little friend would keep fighting for justice together. The next morning, Christopher woke up with the puppy curled against his chest. Lightning lay at the foot of the bed, watching the door. Christopher stretched and sat up, rubbing his eyes. He remembered the night before. Miller was in jail. Emma had justice. And the little puppy had a home. He got dressed and made coffee. The puppy sniffed around the room, curious. Lightning followed, always watching. Christopher smiled. It felt good to have them both. At the station, things were different. Officers nodded at Christopher with respect. Even Captain Reynolds seemed more relaxed. The case had been hard, but they had solved it. Christopher walked to Lightning's crate and placed the puppy inside with a soft blanket. "You're safe now," he whispered. An officer walked up to him. "We found more in Miller's locker," he said. "Files. Names. He was involved in more crimes than we thought." Christopher frowned. "There's more." The officer nodded. "Looks like he was part of a bigger group. We're still checking." Christopher let out a breath. The case wasn't finished. Not yet. He looked at Lightning and the puppy. "Looks like we still have work to do." He grabbed his badge and gun. Lightning stood up, ready. The puppy yawned, then curled up in the blanket. They had won this fight, but justice was never finished. And with his two partners by his side, Christopher knew they were ready for whatever came next.